Hey everyone, this is Thomas Clatterbuck. I'm in the Springfield Daily office at the wonderful Innovate Springfield Incubator in downtown Springfield. My guest today is Mr. Jon Ebel, who's running for Congress in our local 13th district. So thank you so much for being here. Tell me a little bit about yourself. I know you've got a really impressive resume. And why are you running for Congress?
Thanks, Thomas. I appreciate the invitation to be here. I am a professor at the University of Illinois. I teach in the Department of Religion. I've taught there for 12 years, working with students on campus to help them understand world religions and the role of religion in American life. That's my specialization, American religious history. Before I started working on my PhD, I was in the Navy. I spent 4 years on active duty as an intelligence officer and was stationed first in Seoul, Korea, and then outside of Seattle, Washington, on a place called Whidbey Island, and had wonderful experiences in the Navy. I was in the Navy because I had an ROTC scholarship to pay for college. My family really needed that. I really needed that. And I had an amazing experience because of it. The time that I spent in the Navy was really great, enriched me in all kinds of ways, and I was proud to serve. And so that's really why I am in this race, is because I see myself as a public servant. It's something that I haven't just talked about, I've actually lived it. And as I took stock of the country following the 2016 election, I saw a lot of things that were wrong. Not all of them the fault of the Trump administration, some that are kind of enduring problems in our society. And I decided that I wasn't willing to sit back and wait for them to be fixed. I wanted to be a part of the solution myself. And this congressional seat seems right now to be a big part of the problem. I think we need to change the person who's in it.
All right, well, before I get into my sort of prepared questions, you talked about there are things that are wrong. I want to give you the floor to say, what are those things?
Well, the most prominent one for me is our healthcare system. That we are all people. We all are human. We all inhabit these bodies that break down and fail, and we see it all around us. And the fact that someone can go bankrupt because of their humanity, that a family can lose everything that it has because of a chronic illness. That to me is just morally wrong, and we have the resources in this country to address that. We have the knowledge to address it, and the fact that we haven't is to me really an indictment of our society. So I would like to see us move to a Medicare for all system, a single payer system, where that doesn't happen anymore, where every child who needs to see a doctor can see a doctor, every elderly person who needs to see a doctor can see a doctor, and not worry about the cost. So that's a big one. I think, the state of our economy is a problem as well, and I see it as an outgrowth of the mythology that Americans embrace of the rugged individual, that we all are who we are solely by virtue of our own actions. And that's just not true. We all get to where we get in society, whether it's a really prominent powerful place or a more humble place. We get there through the actions and support of other people in addition to our own. And I would like to see an economy, and specifically a tax structure that recognizes that. Right now, our stock market is at an all-time high. The unemployment rate is at an all-time low, and yet we're seeing a tremendous amount of economic distress in our country. And I think that a lot of that is because we have let the social services that we would like to provide, the social safety net that I think we owe to each other, deteriorate. And that's a problem of the economy. It's a problem of the philosophy of our government as well.
Yeah, so that leads into my first question. So we just passed a major tax reform bill, and Rodney Davis was one of the people who voted for it.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Obviously it's a huge bill, but what do you think about it specifically? Was there anything that you liked, anything that you really specifically didn't like?
Well, when I was asked this question in writing a few weeks ago, my response was that I would tear it up and light it on fire. That's sort of how I feel about it. But stepping back a little bit, I did appreciate the impulse or the original motivation to simplify the tax code. That seems to me to be a reasonable thing. And I don't think that we are wrong to want to reduce the tax burden on corporations and on small business owners. But that bill was really based on a couple of lies. The first one is that corporations were paying a 33% tax rate. That's just not true. I mean, that's the advertised rate, but like all individuals, what they actually end up paying, the effective rate is far lower than that. In the case of AT&T, somewhere between 8 and 12%. So to pass a bill motivated by reducing a tax rate that isn't really the actual tax rate seems to me to be pretty deeply problematic. In a more general sense, the way in which the tax bill redistributes wealth up the ladder is, to me, exactly backwards. We should, as an outgrowth of what I was saying, are the fact that we are all where we are because of the actions of lots and lots of different people. Teachers, clergy, custodial staff, first responders, all have contributed to our flourishing as individuals. We should be looking out for those who are making less, who are in some way disadvantaged, not putting more money in the hands of those who really, really don't need it. So if I were to try to fix the tax reform bill, what I would say is, okay, now that we have a corporate tax rate of 22% or 21%, whatever it is, why don't you actually pay that rate? Let's close all the loopholes, and American corporations and businesses will pay a 22% tax rate. And I would like to see also both earned income and unearned income taxed at the same rate, so that the bill, as horrible as it is now law. And I don't want to be a part of another embarrassing repeal and replace chorus like we saw the Republicans engage in for the better part of a decade. I think we try to work within the framework of that bad law to make it better. And those are two things that I would like to see done.
Now, you talked about the trickle down is not the right word. That is not the word that you use. That's not the right idea.
But I would use that word.
Oh,
trickle down is that what they've done is.
Yeah, but just say that how would you is the resources going to the top rather than to the people who make up the base of this country?
Yeah.
Is that a tax issue, or is that a wider sort of structural problem?
Well, I think it's even wider than structure. It's philosophy. It's American mythos. It's the idea that everything that we earn is ours, full stop. And that's just, to me, that is that's contradicted by my experience. I think anyone who's reflective will see that they've gotten to where they are by virtue of the help of lots of people, and as the people who have advantages in the society look at the disadvantaged, they should say, "There, but for the grace of God go I," and provide for those who have less. So also, historically, what we've seen is that when we pass policy that's based on this myth of the rugged individual, when we implement tax policy, it's ruinous. I mean, under the Clinton administration, we were running budget surpluses. I'm old enough to remember this. Things were going very well at the federal government in terms of the budget. We lost an election in 2000, very controversial, and George W. Bush came in and started passing tax cuts. And the argument there was that those tax cuts were going to pay for themselves because it would stimulate the economy, grow the economy, more revenue. That was the second time that argument had been proven false, and it was proven false. We're still digging our way out of the economic ruin caused by that, and now we've passed another law that's very similar philosophically and in its effect, and I'm worried about what the long-term consequences of that are going to be. So, kind of a long answer to your question, but it is both a problem of how we approach things, just philosophically, a problem of the structures of our society, and a problem of the specific tax reform bill that was voted through by Rodney Davis. He put his name on a much worse version of the bill than went through, and I look forward to talking to him about what that bill would have done to graduate education in our district.
No, it's actually really interesting that you bring up philosophy, because that was. You talk about yourselves as being a progressive on your website. You talk about progressive, common sense. What does that mean to you? And sort of what does that word gets thrown around a lot?
It does, yeah.
But for you, what does that mean?
What it means really two things. What it means, first of all, is that progress is possible. That our better days are ahead, that there's still something, some very good place for this American experiment that we're all a part of to go. So the part two of that for me is that the government has not just a role to play in getting us to that better place, but a moral responsibility to try. And so that's why I argue for programs that would have the government more involved in ensuring and stimulating human flourishing, funding education, funding healthcare for all, and not outsourcing infrastructure, not waiting for the commercial sector to catch up and fix roads and own bridges and do rural broadband. These are all things that the government needs to be involved in, at least providing very strong incentives for those things to get done. And I mean, one of the things that has made me a progressive is the experience that I've had watching LGBT people in our society. In college, I had a number of gay friends. I was involved in music, was involved in theater, and had a lot of friends who were just coming out of the closet. And the world that they had to come out into in 1991 was such a much more hostile world, had so far fewer resources, so much less support for them. We've come a long, long way since 1991. There's still a long way to go. And there's still a long way for us to go on a lot of issues, on criminal justice, on racial justice, on economic justice, and on equality. But we have come a great distance, and it's the fact of that forward travel that makes me a progressive, and the hope that we can continue that.
Do you think that progress is inevitable?
No, I think what we've seen in the last couple of years is that history is not over, that the institutions of democracy that we have been building painstakingly for the last roughly 2.5 centuries, that those are fragile. Those are really fragile, and it does not take long to tear them down. So the inevitability of progress, if I thought progress were inevitable, I might not be in this election. I'm here to be a part of a change, and I think we need people who are coming at this from the right moral place, with the right set of values, and the shared embrace of the self-evident truth that all people are created equal. We need those voices in this conversation, and we can't leave it. We can't be complacent. We can't leave it to the so-called forces of history, which boil down to you and I. We can't leave it to the forces of history to solve things.
Thinking of force of history and going forward, and what do you think about climate change? What's the threat, and what should the federal government do? Because those are really two separate questions,
right,
that you can believe one and not the other.
Right. Well, I mean, I could go on for like half an hour, and I won't. Climate change is real. It is demonstrated scientific truth that our climate is changing. The precise ways in which it is changing vary from region to region, from place to place, but the long-term effects will be ruinous for our civilization. The waters that we see rising in Bangladesh, the waters that we see rising in Houston, the tornadoes that we see tearing across the Midwest, those are coming for all of us. Those waters are rising around all of us. And we need to act as a global society and as a member of that global society to mitigate that change and to act responsibly, to interact responsibly with our environment. So, what should the federal government do? I think I'm the one candidate in this race who has signed on to the Off Fossil Fuels Pledge, which is a pledge to move us all the way off of fossil fuels by 2035. Tulsi Gabbard is the one who's kind of sponsoring that in the House. That is important because it is the consumption of fossil fuel, our addiction to fossil fuel, that is driving this, in large part, this climate change, and or climate disruption, we might want to call it. So we have to find a way to end that addiction. And the tools are here. We have the ability to take sunlight and turn it into energy, to take the wind and turn it into energy. We don't yet have the infrastructure or the storage capacity to really maximize that ability, but I see federal government investment in those technologies and the research that leads to more and efficient, better technologies as a crucial part of that. And also as a part of an infrastructure bill, I would love to see the federal government investing both through incentive and in its own build out in a green and renewable infrastructure, so that as we move to electric vehicles, the infrastructure is there to provide them with the electricity that they need to charge up the batteries that move them down the road. So those kinds of incentives that affect our infrastructure and our transportation. I would also like to see more robust incentives in the upcoming Farm Bill for our agricultural communities to experiment with cover crops and with less disruptive ways of fertilizing their crops, and more sort of long-term sustainable agriculture. Those are. It's such a big topic.
Oh,
There's so many things to
global topic.
But it's like the research needs to be done. The infrastructure needs to be there to optimize and implement that research. And then we also, I do believe that we as individuals have an incredible capacity for empathy. And as we look around the world and we see the suffering of humans, we see the suffering of animals, that we can very easily discern that this is a big problem. And I'm sick of those who deny the science, who stick their heads in the sand and pretend like good, hardworking, very smart people are not already very aware of what's going on and are unwilling to listen to them because it somehow feels wrong, or because they're in the pocket of the fossil fuel industry.
And then when you talk about going green,
Mm-hmm.
I know this is a more controversial thing in the environmental field. How do you feel about nuclear power?
Well, I think that nuclear power it's at least part of the transition. That one of the ongoing, the enduring problems with wind and solar is storage and the kind of intermittent nature of the supply. So what nuclear can do is stand in the gap. It is safer. It is less polluting, and requires far less maintenance and upkeep than our fossil fuel industry, fossil fuel extraction and distribution. So, plus it has the benefit of already being in place. Long term. I guess one of the enduring concerns with nuclear is the disposal of the fuel rods. And one thing that I know is that I don't know everything, and that there are some very smart people at the University of Illinois and across this country who are working to think through and make those make the storage or disposal of those rods a safer and maybe even an energy productive exercise.
No, for sure. That I've been to those lectures, and great people at the University of Illinois.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then thinking of technology that's come out of the University of Illinois, how do you feel about net neutrality? How do you feel about the decision to remove some of those regulations and remove some of those protocols that have been in place for a couple of years?
It's wrong. I think it's illegal. There are 22 attorneys general in the United States have filed suit against the FEC, and I think that they will win that suit. So I think it was a horrible decision, but one that's entirely predictable when you have an administration in the White House that is nothing but in the pocket of industry, doing nothing but trying to enrich those who are in big telecom or big pharma or the fossil fuel industry. So everyone saw that coming, and we have to, in the meantime, sort of live with the consequences. But if the federal government is going to be investing in broadband extension into rural communities, which it absolutely needs to do, the necessary precursor for that, in my book, is that it be absolutely net neutral. This is now the connective tissue of our society. It's the connective tissue of our economy, and we can't be playing privilege with that connective tissue.
On that connective tissue, I know you talked about the global community and about America's global responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
During the Obama administration, we gave up some of the domain registry capacity with the ICANN to
Mm-hmm.
allow where the domains are being registered and some of that internet infrastructure and governance. Do you agree with that decision? Should America be in control of its own internet?
You know, it's a challenging question because of the ways in which that infrastructure is vulnerable, and we've seen those vulnerabilities. At the very least, I think that we as a nation need to think much more clearly, much more aggressively about securing that infrastructure. And if that means holding on to those domains and being in charge of all of that as a matter of a kind of internet nationalism, then that might be a price that we need to pay. But I would really have to look more closely at that issue before I formulated any sort of firm policy position.
No, I'd rather you said I don't know than say something that's wrong. So I guess, what's your X factor? I mean, you say all the right words. You say, you've got a great resume, but sort of what's that thing that makes you? There's a lot of people running. There's a lot of people who are saying the words. What makes you special, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that's a hard thing. I mean, I try to be a pretty humble person. I guess if you look at my resume, one of the things that might stand out is my military service. That I'm a veteran, and I'm the only veteran in this race on either side. So what does that mean? It means that I don't just talk the talk of service, I walk the walk. And it also means that for all of my progressive views and values and the policies that I support, I am experienced in working in in living the bipartisanship of military service. What do I mean by that? I mean that as a naval intelligence officer, I was surrounded by and working with and working for people with whom I disagreed politically. I mean, really different sets of ideas. And yet, we had a job that we had to get done. And I was a part of a team that got that stuff done. And it feels to me like this moment in American history is one in which we are really losing touch with what the job is that needs to get done, and really how to move forward in a kind of bipartisan way, which is really the only way that durable legislation is going to get passed. So I have lived that. And as an outgrowth of my military service, I have signed on to a pledge that is being circulated among veterans running for Congress. And that is a pledge that, if elected, I will meet at least once a month with a member of the Republican Party. And that once a year I will propose a piece of bipartisan legislation. This is predicated on the truth, really, that bipartisanship requires practice. It doesn't just happen. You need to work at it. Working across differences requires practice and is based on relationships of trust. And so I am more than happy to be a part of that. I'm also the only candidate, because of the military service, I'm the only candidate in this race who knows what foreign policy feels like and who really has any kind of meaningful foreign policy experience. And it's interesting. The foreign policy, whether it's military affairs, whether it's the House Intelligence Oversight Committee. There are many ways, and then just getting back to the basics of the War Powers Act, many ways in which Congress needs to be involved in foreign policy. That's not an insignificant part of this job. And I would hope that the people of the 13th District of the state of Illinois would want somebody going to Washington who has that experience, who has lived in Korea and spent 15 months watching the North Koreans. That was my first job as an intelligence officer. And who can bring that sort of experience to broader policy conversations about if and when to commit American forces to particular regions around the world. Also, who's lived alongside those women and men and knows that their lives are precious, that they're not just numbers on a sheet, that those are individuals who are members of families and communities, and that if we lose even one of them, that's a real tragedy. I feel like at this moment, with the historic low in the number of veterans who are in Congress, we may be losing touch with that. And we certainly don't have a president who has any sort of empathy for military men and women. So that to me is what I think most clearly separates me from the other people running in this race.
No, it's not insignificant.
I think it's a meaningful thing. And it is a race, and I run marathons. I've run 17 marathons. So another thing that you know about me is that I am determined and I am disciplined, and I have a tolerance for pain. Politics is a painful business. I think you want someone who does not shy away from pain and will not stop running a race until that race is over.
All right, and I guess just one final question. You've got a primary coming up on March 20th.
Yes.
And primaries historically have pretty low turnout.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say, not to your base, but to a moderate, to an independent, somebody who's really not thinking they should pull that Democrat ballot, what would you say to them?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, it's their decision. It's their decision which ballot to pull. But I would remind them of what's going on in Washington right now, that we have a rogue president who is trashing our country, both at home and abroad, and has shown no common sense, no common decency in his dealing with the professional, committed servants of this country. And that he has a Congress right now that is entirely complicit, that has not at all stood up and rejected his politics of division and destruction. So Rodney Davis is a part of that. And what I would hope from the independent voter is that they would look closely at the Democratic field and choose the person who has the experience and the qualifications to stand up to Rodney Davis, to win that race in November of 2018, and to go to Washington and get done what it is that he says he's going to get done.
No, well, thank you so much
Thomas,
for being here. This is
you're welcome.
Mr.
Thank you.
Jon Ebel running for Congress in the 13th district.
That's right.
Thanks for being here.
You're welcome.